In 1918, during World War I, the Marine Corps made a huge change as women broke down the barriers and joined the United States Marine Corps. The Corps wasn't the only one making changes as America jumped into the Roaring Twenties, an age of dramatic social and political change. The 1920s, a time of jazz music, the Charleston and Foxtrot, the Prohibition, and a time you could get a new car for $260. The 20s were a major time in history for the New Woman movement. Women began stepping out of the home and into protest lines, demanding the same basic rights and opportunities afforded to men. And when finally given the opportunity, women took full advantage. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. Early 20th century America was a time of massive change for both society and the Marine Corps. Women began to work white-collar jobs. Along with working these jobs, women like Opha May Johnson began walking in uncharted territory for women. On August 13, 1918, Johnson made history when she became the first woman to enlist in the Marine Corps Reserves for clerical duties. Johnson's first duties were as a clerk at Marine Corps headquarters, managing the records of other female Marines who joined after she did. After the war ended, women were discharged from the military, including Johnson, who went on to work as a clerk in the War Department. It would take 24 years before the Marine Corps called upon the brave women of America to serve once again.
In 1918, as World War I was coming to an end, women made a huge change and broke down the barriers and joined the United States Marine Corps. The Corps wasn't the only one making changes, as America jumped into the Roaring Twenties, an age of dramatic social and political change. Massive change was happening all around, and the Marine Corps was no exception. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. The 1920s, a time of jazz music, the Charleston, Foxtrot, the Prohibition, and a time you could get a new car for $260. The 20s were a major time in history for the New Woman movement. Women earned the right to vote when the 19th Amendment was passed. They began working in white-collar jobs, had increased availability for birth control. As both society and the Marines were undergoing massive change, many women enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves in 1918, including Opha May Johnson, who was the first known woman to enlist. Prior to her enlistment, she worked as a civil service employee at the headquarters of the Marines, where she received an assignment to be a clerk in the office of a quartermaster general. Sadly, their service was short-lived after World War I came to a close, because on July 15, 1919, the Marine Corps issued an order for women reservists and those on clerical duty to be moved to inactive status. Even though it was military office work and short-lived, Johnson broke down the barriers for generations of future Marines to come.
Women's suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache, crowned by victory.
The 1930s, a time known in history as the Great Depression era. It started after the stock market crash of October 29, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday. Not only were the country's economics not around, neither were women in the Corps after they were moved to inactive status in 1919. Despite the Great Depression causing an extremely high unemployment rate and economic struggles, while the Dust Bowl was destroying the agriculture, some positive things happened during this time. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. The 1930s were known for jazz music, swing dancing, and the Prohibition coming to an end, allowing alcohol to be transported and sold legally in the US. It also was a golden age for Hollywood, releasing films like Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, The Wizard of Oz, and Gone with the Wind. Although women were not in the Corps during the 30s, they were still making a difference. Famous women during this time were actresses like Judy Garland and Shirley Temple, who took the entertainment industry by storm, and trailblazers like Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt. Amelia Earhart was an American aviation pioneer, author, and first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, while Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the 32nd U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, redefined the role of the First Lady. She held her own press conferences, traveled to all parts of the country independently, and broadcasted radio addresses.
Is she also a newspaper columnist?
Yes.
Is it Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
Mrs. Franklin Delano.
Although women did not have a large role in the Corps during the 1930s, massive change for women in the military was coming in the 40s.
1 year before America entered World War II, Timely Comics released Captain America Comics #1. One panel in the comic depicted the Star-Spangled Hero punching Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. Little did they know, that panel was a foreshadow of what would take place in the coming decade. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. December 7th, 1941. A dark day in American history. 2,403 American lives lost. 3 ships destroyed. Though the United States attempted to stay neutral through the first 2 years of World War II, the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor forced the United States to declare war and enter the worldwide conflict. On September 16, 1940, President Roosevelt signed the Selective Training and Service Act, requiring the registration of all men between 21 and 35 for a draft. With a good portion of able-bodied men being sent off to war, many jobs were left that needed to be filled. To entice women to try new jobs, Rosie the Riveter was brought to life. As women were changing, so was life in general, such as fashion, cars, movies, music, technology, and people's mindsets. In 1942, while America awaited the release of Walt Disney's future hit movie Bambi, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox authorized the Marine Corps to create the Women's Reserve, and by November 7th, Commandant Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb approved the formation of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. Unlike World War I, women played a more prominent role. Women like Colonel Ruth Cheney Streeter, the first director of Women Marine Reservist, Captain Ann Lentz, the first commissioned officer, and February 13th, 1943, officially opened enlistments for women. The first woman to join was Private Lucille McLaren. Within a year, the Women's Reserve went from 4 women to nearly 15,000 with over 200 assignments. While the war created a hole in the American workforce, it also left a hole in the world of sports. Americans looked upon the world of sports as a distraction during these dark times, so women stepped up to fill in for the men. The All-American Girls Baseball League was started in 1943 as an attempt to replace Major League Baseball, which had been canceled due to the war. With the end of the war came more drastic changes for women. Society feared that there would no longer be jobs for the returning men, and women were encouraged to return to their rightful place. Many women did not take kindly to that. Women like Annie Graham from Detroit, Michigan, the first African-American woman to enlist in the Marine Corps. With the activation of 3rd Recruit Battalion at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island, women began arriving to form the first platoon of 50 women Marines to take a training course for non-veteran women Marines. As women took a lead role in the Marine Corps, the public immediately began inventing catchy nicknames for them. While many of the nicknames were cute plays on words, to single them out as women, like Dainty Devil Dogs or Glam Marines, General Holcomb thought of a more suitable name for them. In an article published in Time magazine on May 27, 1944, he said, "They are Marines. They don't have a nickname and they don't need one. They get their basic training in a Marine atmosphere at a Marine post. They inherit the traditions of Marines. They are Marines." Though World War II led to an increase in women in the workforce and military, it also led to the start of a boom.
As World War II was coming to an end and America's servicemen began returning home, the United States entered a time in history known as the Baby Boom era, also known as the Fabulous 50s. The rise of rock and roll, the jitterbug, and the Red Scare of communism made its way throughout the hearts and minds of most Americans. The beginning of the Korean conflict caused women Marines to take more prominent non-combat roles, due to men on the front lines once again. This opened the doors for Marines like Chief Warrant Officer Ruth Wood and Staff Sergeant Barbara Barnwell to step up and serve proudly. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. The 1950s was a breakthrough decade for everything, from household items to the entertainment industry, and to international events like the Korean conflict, where the Marine Corps was called upon to fight in heavy combat. This mobilized the Women Marines Reserve to support all non-combatant tasks. Meanwhile, products like Mr. Potato Head, the first TV remote, and Velcro were in the homes of many Americans who were chasing the American dream. Despite the war, many famous TV shows debuted, such as I Love Lucy, The Ed Sullivan Show, and What's My Line, a game show where a panel of judges tried to guess a person's line of work. Those judges probably wouldn't have been able to guess Lieutenant Colonel Julia Hamlet's line of work. She was the new director of the Women Marines Reserve in 1953. More prominent women Marines like Chief Warrant Officer Ruth Wood, the first woman to go through the Warrant Officers Program, made a lasting impact on the Corps' history. Marines like Staff Sergeant Barbara Barnwell, the first female to earn the Navy Marine Corps Medal for saving a fellow Marine from drowning in 1952, showed that women Marines are always on duty. One can see that the 50s brought a plethora of memorable icons of American culture, and it also brought many opportunities to women within the Marine Corps. These Marines are shining examples of the Corps' values of honor, courage, commitment, and continue to pave the way for future female Marines. Despite the Korean conflict ending in early 1953, America was still fighting communism in the upcoming hippie era of the 60s. Just over a decade since the conclusion of the United States' involvement in the Korean conflict, the fight against communism brought American forces to Vietnam. During the 1960s, also known as the Decade of Discontent, protests of social norms broke out all across the country, like the anti-war and civil rights movements. While some minorities were fighting for equality, other minorities like women were thriving in the Marine Corps. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. The 1960s, a time of the Beatles, and Martin Luther King telling the world about his dream for the civil rights of all Americans. While the fight for equality spread throughout the country, women were rising up in the Marine Corps. Marines like Master Gunnery Sergeant Geraldine M. Moran and Sergeant Major Bertha Billib, the first women to become E9s, and Rose Franco, the first Hispanic woman to be promoted to Chief Warrant Officer. The 60s was a time of breaking down the traditional social roles, like women staying at home, cooking, and cleaning. Master Sergeant Barbara Delinsky, on the other hand, took that to another level. Not only was she out of the house, but she was overseas in Vietnam, becoming the first woman to serve in a combat zone. As America underwent a variety of changes, so did the Corps when they assigned Staff Sergeant Josephine Geber to be the first woman on attaché duty. Later in her career, she would also be the first woman to receive the Combat Action Ribbon. The 1960s was a creative time, with inventions coming out like the ATM machine, the first video game console, and audio cassettes. The nation was climbing to new heights, just like women in the Marine Corps, as they wrapped up the decade by launching astronauts out of the atmosphere and into the disco era of the 70s.
We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51.
The fight for equality continued in the 1970s as women all across the country banded together, creating organizations like the National Organization for Women to fight for the respect and rights they thought they earned with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women would no longer be forced to be domesticated. Gone were the days of asking for a more prominent role in the male-dominated society. The women were going to take it. Women began fighting their way into territory previously unheard of, including in the Marine Corps. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. The 1970s were a time of firsts for women in all facets of society. Katharine Graham became the first female Fortune 500 CEO when she took the helm of the Washington Post. Barbara McClintock became the first woman to win a solo Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology and Medicine for the discovery of mobile genetic elements. Actress Shirley Temple became both the first female chief of national and international diplomatic protocol. While women were making strides in the civilian world, female Marines were shattering the glass ceiling and taking on military roles previously unavailable to them. Marines like Margaret Brewer, who became the first female to be promoted to Brigadier General, Lance Corporal Harriet Voisin, who became the first female military policeman, Gunnery Sergeant Mary Vaughn became the first African American to become a warrant officer. Marines like Lieutenant Catherine Kokurik Genovese proved that women belonged in the Corps when she became the first female to earn a sharpshooter badge. Though wearing the badge was unauthorized in female uniforms, Kokura Genovese took so much pride in her accomplishment that she hid the badge under her tie. These groundbreakers would set the tone, as bucking the status quo will become the attitude that will be passed down to female Marines for generations to come.
In the 80s, women in and out of the Marine Corps continued to amaze the world. The 1980s was an out-of-this-world experience because of women like Sally Ride, the first American woman to become an astronaut, Marines like Sergeant Major Ellie Judge, the first female Sergeant Major of Camp Pendleton, and many more women Marines made advancements throughout the decade. It was a time in history when women in positions of power became more common. Although these women still had to prove to the world that they could step up to the challenge, the 80s was a time when women were forging their own path to success and accomplishment. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. The 80s was a time of rock music and revolution was driven by headstrong women. In 1983, Sally Ride surpassed the glass ceiling and broke through Earth's atmosphere on the Space Shuttle Challenger. Just 1 year later, Joanne Benoit won gold at the first ever Women's Olympic Marathon. Women were becoming more adventurous. For instance, Anne Bancroft trekked to the North Pole by foot and dog sled in 1986. Women in the Corps were also making accomplishments. Marines like Sergeant Major Ellie Judge, who was the first female Sergeant Major of Camp Pendleton and served for over 30 years. During this time, women in the Corps were marching to the same tune of success, like First Lieutenant Marie Giuliano, the first female rifle platoon leader for drills and parades, paving the way for female officers to train with the Mameluke sword. Despite many years of inequality, women in and out of the Corps began to receive recognition for their skill and leadership. This led to the further use of women in the 90s for a bigger operation.
While the American population was still recovering from all the headbanging of the 80s, American culture decided to say, "What up?" to the starter jacket Air Jordan's new hip-hop style of the 90s. Just like America's hip-hop culture had their game changers, like Snoop Dogg, Ice Cube, Tupac, and Dr. Dre, so did women in the Corps, like Colonel Gilda Jackson, Lieutenant General Carol Mutter, Sergeant Roxanne Conrad, and Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Crimmins. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. The 1990s, a time of Full House, Michael Jordan, and the infamous
"You've Got Mail."
The Walkman broke down barriers by giving people the ability to listen to music without a boombox. Women were also breaking down barriers in the music world when Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Crimmins became the first female to earn the Drum Major Military Occupational Specialty and gave her the ability to conduct history in marked time. In 1992, the Summer Olympics were held in Barcelona, with the United States taking home 108 medals during the Games. One of the athletes for the Americans was none other than Sergeant Roxanne Conrad. She competed in the Olympics in Barcelona. She was the first female double distinguished with pistol and international awards. She also competed in the 1991 and 1995 Pan American Games and became the first female range officer at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island after becoming a Chief Warrant Officer. The 90s were a time of advancement for all female Marines. In 1995, Gilda Jackson became the first African-American female to achieve the rank of colonel while on active duty, and she became the first woman to command the Naval Aviation Depot, Cherry Point, North Carolina. The 90s affected women of all ranks, from lower enlisted to generals, like Lieutenant General Carol Mutter, who became the first female 3-star general in the U.S. Armed Forces when she assumed the position of Deputy Chief of Staff for Manpower and Reserve Affairs in Washington, D.C. As the 90s brought a huge leap into the modern era, these Marines brought a new spin on the expectations of Marines, changing it to Why Not 2K, jumping into the new millennium of the 2000s.
The 2000s were the turn of the millennium, bringing a new wave of trailblazers, major historical events, brave women of the Marine Corps, and America answered the call of duty. The 2000s were a time of taking action. Marines like Captain Vernice Armour, the first African-American female combat pilot, blew past all expectations and proved herself worthy to be a respected leader. Women were serving in more prominent roles in leadership and combat support. Other prominent women include Condoleezza Rice, who served as the first female African-American Secretary of State, and Sonia Sotomayor became the first Hispanic Supreme Court Justice. These women are just a drop in the bucket compared to the rest of the women who challenged the status quo. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. Unfortunately, the early 2000s began with tragedy, when on September 11, 2001, the Twin Towers were attacked. This caused a surge in enlistments. All branches of the armed forces were mobilized for combat. The war on terror was on, and the Corps was ready to fight tooth and nail in defense of America. Marines like Captain Vernice Armour, the first African-American female combat pilot, Armour served with HMLA 169 during the invasion of Iraq, completing 2 tours of devoted service. Armour wasn't the only female Marine to fly into enemy fire. Captain Elizabeth Okariba was one of the first women to graduate with a Marine Corps aviation contract, and she was the first woman ever to pilot the MV-22 Osprey. While the skies were being protected, just as equally capable Marines helped capture the hearts and minds of the locals with the all-female Marine Task Force, which was part of 3rd Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment in southern Afghanistan. The task force's all-female team was created to interact with the female Afghan population, providing access to half of the population that is normally cut off. The task force proved successful and accomplished the mission in support of Operation Pathfinder. Outside the Corps, women were still proving to the nation that they were more than capable of holding political offices. Earning the nickname Warrior Princess for her political prowess and tenacity, Condoleezza Rice served as the first African-American National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush. Women serving in high positions also stretched to the Supreme Court. Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic appointed to serve on the Supreme Court in 2009, she hit the ground running by taking on multiple cases and working for the benefit of the American people. She took on cases like JDB versus North Carolina in 2011 and United States versus Alvarez and other notable cases, all in defense of the American people and their unalienable rights. These outstanding women proved to the world that they are more than capable of being true professionals with strong bearing. No matter the task, whether it be supporting Marines from the air or supporting the American people at home, these women shine their brightest even under stress, showing that modern America is a place where women can accomplish anything and make their goals come true. In 100 years, women throughout the world have accomplished what was once thought impossible. Women have smashed gender roles into memory and blazed trails that had previously been known only to men. From entertainment to politics to the battlefield, women have broken down every barrier and breached every closed door. Hillary Clinton, Aisha Evans, Nadia Murad, Jeanette Epps, Emma Watson, Beyonce, Anna Brnovich, Lieutenant Colonel Megan Brodkin, Lieutenant General Lori Reynolds, and the estimated 4.5 million women from around the world who marched together showcasing solidarity and strength in gender equality have proven that this decade has been one for the record books. 1 century ago, Opha May Johnson, who at the age of 40 bravely volunteered her services to her country and began a journey for women in the Marine Corps, a journey that thousands of women have continued to this day. Women throughout the Corps have, are, and will break down every figurative and literal barriers placed in front of them. This is the present decade. This is the Marine Corps through the decades. By 2010, women in the Corps have accomplished so many firsts that we wouldn't blame you for thinking that there was nothing else to accomplish. Well, Staff Sergeant Tricia McBride proved otherwise. In 2010, McBride became the first female to receive the Advisor Training Group's stamp of approval to advise Afghan forces. This was monumental because this accomplishment coincided with the increasing women's rights movement going on in the region during, at the time, the deadliest year for NATO during the Afghan War. Female Marines weren't just breaking down figurative barriers, though. In 2013, Gunnery Sergeant Robin Baker became the first female master breacher after successfully completing the Marine Corps Urban Breachers course, and one of only 2 females to ever teach at the Combat Engineer School. While these women set the tone for the decade, there was still still a few things that female Marines had to accomplish to fully break through institutional limitations. Though female Marines accomplished so much in the past century, they found themselves still cut out of one aspect of the Marine Corps: the infantry. That is, until PFC's Cristina Fuentes Montenegro, Julia Carroll, and Katie Gores came along. These three women became the first females to graduate the Marine Corps Enlisted Infantry Training Course in 2013. The following year, Sergeant Major Angela Manis changed recruit training forever when she became the first female Sergeant Major of Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island, just 1 year after becoming the first female senior enlisted Marine at Marine Barracks, Washington. Though they only account for 8.3% of today's Marine Corps, Marines like Lieutenant Marina A. Hierl, the first and only woman in the Marine Corps to lead an infantry platoon, continue to blaze the path set forth by the original 300-plus women and show a new generation of young girls nothing can stop them from accomplishing their goals. Semper Fidelis to the female Marines of past, present, and future. Thank you for your service and contributions to your Corps, my Corps, our Corps. Oorah, Marines. Oorah.